So this is the part of the day where we get to talk to the people who make the specifications that you all implement and use every day. So I have a very distinguished panel of people who have done very, very detailed things. What I would like to do first is just have you run through and really quickly give us an idea of what kind of specifications and standards you've worked on in the identity world. Annabelle, we'll start with you.
Yeah. So my name is Annabelle Backman. I'm a software engineer in the AWS Identity Organization. From the standards space perspective, my focus has been on the risk and incident sharing and cooperation work, which is some relatively new work we're trying to do where we want to be able to share signals about security events between different parties that rely on one another for identity or authentication. So whether that's through an explicit federated relationship, like via OIDC, or just due to the fact that you used, say, your Google email address to create an account on Amazon or Facebook or whatever.
Perfect. Vittorio?
Vittorio. I work for Auth0 as an architect, and as you can hear from my accent, I'm from Washington State. I couldn't resist, I had to say it. And I started working with standards back in early 2000. My license plate is WS star, and I'm not ashamed. So. It's a cautionary tale. And nowadays, I work mostly on very tactical things, as in like crossing the last mile between the abstract specification and what developers actually have to do for making this thing work in practice. And so I work on currently on a profile for making things a bit more interoperable. And in general, I participated to the larger discussions, but I focus mostly on tactical stuff.
John Bradley, work at Yubico. I guess I started off in standards back in the 90s, although I didn't realize I was working on standards, doing Radius, which refuses to die, LDAP, which secure LDAP, which refuses to die. In the 90s, InfoCard, which did die. OpenID 2, SAML, on into the 2000s actually, Pam warned me, so I actually Googled myself, and it turns out I have 10 RFCs, worked as a contributor on another 10, and I have 10 that I'm going to deliver real soon now because people are nagging me. But mostly I'm working on WebAuthn, token binding, and other sorts of newer standards. And as it turns out, the work that we did almost 8 years ago with self-issued OpenID Connect seems to be resurfacing. So we haven't actually had a new idea since, I think, mutual TLS authenticated LDAP. We've just improved the deployment. No, it's true.
Okay, I'm Kim Cameron. I have absolutely never written a standard. Somehow I got invited to this panel, and it's a very nice view here.
It's because you had Mike and I do it for you.
So I think this whole audience should know that Kim Cameron is the author of the 7 Laws of Identity, so I consider a law to be at least equivalent to a standard. And Kim, you are a standards body unto yourself.
I'm certainly a body, that's for sure. Anyway, what can I say? I'm here, I guess, representing the engineering community who are part of the standards process, because we often discover the problems that standards have to solve and go through the process and do all the early implementations. And so I've been doing that since about the beginning. Even X509, which preceded LDAP.
X500, zoom it.
Anyway, Monsieur.
Thank you, Kim. I'm Brian Campbell. I'm with Ping Identity. I got involved in standards when we were working to do implementations of SAML 2, and I had some questions. Mostly were like, what the hell does this mean? So I started asking those questions on the mailing list, and before I knew it, I was a co-chair of the working group. Since then, I've sort of followed the herd and taken the work to the OpenID Foundation and the IETF, working on OpenID and the OAuth class of protocols. And I think Pam was kind enough to call some of my work the little extensions around OAuth. Most of the things I work on are refining and adapting OAuth to specific needs and cases.
Great. And so actually, Brian, you have given the best description I have ever heard of what it means to work in the standards community, which is that we travel to exotic locations and then cram ourselves into tiny little rooms with no windows to debate details. So that is literally what we do. So why is it that all these great standards meetings happen in exotic locations?
It's amazing, isn't it? We go to places like Singapore and Thailand and Prague, and Berlin, and then lock ourselves in a roomless or a windowless basement room and argue about whether it should be a semicolon or a comma. But as a photographer on the side, I don't actually mind going to these wonderful locations. I do sneak out in the evenings a little bit, but I think it's under the auspice of trying to make standards a globally accessible thing. There are participants from all over the world, and by taking meetings to locations, it makes it more accessible. At least the ideas makes it more accessible for participants from all over the world to actually be involved.
Makes perfect sense. Anyone else want to talk about their perhaps favorite, most exotic location?
Well, not all of us live in the U.S., and many of us are afraid of it, so.
It's very true. All right, so I'm not saying anything. So we're trying to work on these standards, and they're fairly geeky, very technical bits and pieces, right? So we don't necessarily want to dive into the details, but there's a lot of new and exciting stuff going on right now. So for example, in the OAuth area, there's some really interesting new developing standards. And Vittorio, you are proposing a standard right now for access tokens. Do you want to just describe a little bit about what that is?
Absolutely. The idea behind that part is that no plan survives contact with the enemy. And OAuth is a specification that leaves a number of details open to the choice to every implementer. And OAuth has been mainstream for a number of years now. And so we have seen a number of practices emerge, and people organically start making the same choices over and over again independently because the specification wasn't really telling them what to do. And so the outcome is that functionally we are all pretty equivalent, but we all speak slightly different dialects. And so the thrust behind this profile is to try to give guidance so that people can achieve the things that they are already achieving in proprietary ways, but in a standard format, so that we can now develop skills that transfer across vendors, use SDKs that work with everyone instead of each of us having a different SDK. So that's the simplified idea.
Fantastic. Is anyone else working on the access token bits now? Okay, I'll take that as a no. So I would be interested to know what you all think has changed about the standards world since the SAML days. So we're still cramming ourselves in rooms, we're still trying to work out details, but why is it that SAML is the 800-page monolith and OAuth is the tiny little bits of standards? Like, how are we improving the standards world? Okay, we'll start with John.
So I have thought about this a bit in, having been involved both with OAuth, OpenID Connect, and SAML. Part of it was we thought we were smarter when we did SAML. So SAML had an answer to everything, and you needed to profile it down, and it was very hard to extend, something between hard to impossible. Whereas moving from XML to JSON actually had kind of the subtle change in structure. So JSON is easy to extend, whereas XML was hard. So we could start off, there were a lot of things that I wanted to put in OpenID Connect that Brian and other people stopped me. So it could have been much larger, but Mike sort of had the principle of, Mike Jones from Microsoft had the principle of keeping simple things simple. So what we did was we defined the minimum set of things that we could all agree on, and then later we could add additional things as we found new functionality. So while proof of possession wasn't in the initial spec, it has been added. So we just we learned enough that we sort of turned the telescope around and started small and added to it, as opposed to defining everything and trying to profile it down?
In many ways, it mirrors some of the things you've seen in the general software development industry. Although standards trail it by a little bit, we're still catching up. That there's less of an attempt to do a big upfront design of everything first, and more of an attempt to make pragmatic steps towards delivering real value and real functionality. And it's not perfect. We have a ways to go, but the sort of the O suite of protocols have done more to sort of provide real value in smaller, more easily reusable components that can be built upon and extended later on down the road.
And small incremental additions keeps us employed. So.
Right.
Well, I think
Job security is
job security.
there's one other issue, which is that as we went further along in the process, we knew what we were doing. At the beginning, we didn't know what we were doing, and so the standard would include a whole bunch of things that didn't matter.
Yeah, it's definitely.
And so as you go on it, you actually do learn. And so with respect to Andrew's comments last night, there actually is progress here. It may not be the kind of progress we crave, but it is progress.
Absolutely.
It's definitely been kind of building, each new standard is kind of building on the ones that came before, even if there's not an actual technical relationship there. There's standing on the shoulders of the people who built the previous standards and what they learned, and baking that into the next model. One of the big things that I think we've seen improve over time that's come out of that is thinking about the usability of these things from an implementer standpoint. You look at OAuth 1.0, one of the big learnings from that experience was, hey, all of this crypto stuff is really cool, but it's also really hard. If we're putting all of this on the implementer, then that's going to hurt adoption. That's going to hinder people, the usability of the standard. And so in OAuth 2.0, we kind of turned that around. We took a different approach. And that's I think we're continuing to see that going forward.
Right, and speaking of things that really are new and different, the two specifications that people here have probably heard a lot of this week would be risk and also WebAuthn. So, the concept of events is relatively new in that we've always tried to make our identity systems stateless. So I'll start with you, Annabelle. What do you think about this new world where we have security event tokens flying around, and what does the performance and scalability look like?
I think it's interesting you used the word stateless. I think in the context of risk, the goal isn't so much necessarily to introduce state, but to recognize that now that we've introduced all these ideas of single sign-on and centralized identity providers, there's a kind of implicit coupling together between systems. And we need to recognize that and recognize the security implications of that, and find a way to counteract the potential for the domino effect we see of I break into this account, that lets me break into that account, and that account, and that account, and now I've maybe gone from something that you didn't think was that important to something that's very important. So that doesn't necessarily require state, but it requires some communication of information between some of those different parties. As to the question of scalability, I think that's something that we've actually had to deal with a lot in talking about particularly on the protocol side. There was a lot of debate in the Sec Event Working Group over how do we make sure that, say, the transmitter, we're communicating the security event to the recipient, that communication path is going to be scalable. And the answer is we've ended up kind of defining multiple ways of doing that for different situations and different use cases, as we realized, hey, you know what, one size doesn't actually fit all.
Right.
So I think it's going to be a matter of each implementer looking at what is their use case, what is their what are their needs for their environment, and building the solution is going to work for them.
Perfect. Anyone else want to weigh in? Then we'll jump right to WebAuthn. So WebAuthn has, in fact, a kind of a time element too, in that it requires people to use user gestures in order to release cryptographic keys. But where do you all see how do we get to ubiquity? What is the path that we have to take? The standards are done, but what is the path we have to take towards getting it to the point where it's ubiquitous, where it's just used everywhere?
Well, I think that's a problem with all standards. I was thinking about sort of Alex's wave analogy, and that's kind of true in each standard. If you look at OpenID Connect as an example, it took us roughly 5 years to go from idea to spec, another 5 years to go to get ubiquitous adoption, which requires certification, deployment, et cetera. Then after the first 10 years, you're considered an overnight success in the banking industry, and other people adopt you and say, why don't you have vertical integrations targeted for us, et cetera? And you start getting into, like in OpenID, you have FAPI for financial, eGov for government, and a lot of verticals are now saying, yes, since this is ubiquitous, how does it apply to our thing? And probably in another 5 years, people will start sunsetting it. I mean, all of these things have their sort of natural life cycle. We've spent, Google and Yubico started U2F maybe 5-ish years ago, and now we're at the release cycle. Now it's a matter of, just last week I did my first WebAuthn on iOS, authentication on iOS, working with a browser. So all of the browsers are moving towards a common set of features because there's a lot of optionality in these specs. Yes, just because you support WebAuthn doesn't mean that a given browser on a given platform will support it for passwordless login, for Microsoft accounts. The general version of Chrome doesn't quite work, but the version that's coming out, 76, has all of the features for being able to log into Microsoft accounts. Firefox on Windows does, but on OS X doesn't, et cetera. So it's a matter of building up the sort of ubiquitous infrastructure so that people can have the confidence to deploy, and that's probably the latter half of this year. It will be available pretty much everywhere. Then it's a matter of getting the relying parties, and I've been working with GitHub over the last couple of weeks on their. Maybe at some point they will release WebAuthn, which I can't speak of one way or the other. But when they do, it'll be really good. If they do, when it'll be good. These people Google has converted all of their authentications over to WebAuthn now. The relying parties have to get experience, and then we're starting the next version of CTAP 2, WebAuthn 2.1, or level 2, or whatever the W3C calls it. So after people start using it, you learn what you got wrong, what was ambiguous in the specs. You have to go back and clarify so that both Microsoft and Google, where they've disagreed on how to implement something, we actually clarify the specs so that somebody else can come along and do it the same way. So it's a cycle, and it's going to take another 5 years for it to be a given that anybody would question doing anything else other than WebAuthn to authenticate to a site.
Vittorio, what about you? What about the developer? What's the developer path?
So I'm very, very biased, of course, because my employer is an aggregator. But I think that aggregators are going to play a key role for this. Because the idea is that by decoupling applications from details like this one, people might just be able to switch to use one of the aggregators, and one of the options is going to be this. And so from the point of view of their coding, they will not have to change anything at all. They simply say, this is one option, just like today they flip a switch and say, I want to add MFA, but their code base didn't have to change. So I think that we'll have a role to play to popularize this. And although I agree with John that there is a natural trajectory for these kind of things to develop, I think that everything is accelerating. So I am uncharacteristically optimistic. It will take less than 5 years to get there. But then again, I'm not going to bet any money on that.
Right. And
I've also had a few horses shot out from under me, so
a few.
I'm doing an average.
Brian, you've been recently working on a lot of high assurance specification pieces, right? For FAPI, something CIBA, the client-initiated back channel stuff. So you sort of have a unique perspective on how we could start to tie OpenID Connect and OAuth and WebAuthn together. Are you seeing that desire in the financial working groups right now?
I don't think it's there yet. Things are emerging, and I don't think that the connection's been made yet to really get that. There's a lot of regulation and requirements around customer authentication and strong customer authentication, know your customer, and so forth that need to catch up with WebAuthn, I think, and cross over between those sort of worlds. Most of the work I've been doing so far is profiling the actual tokens and runtime flows to cover the high assurance cases, but it all falls back to the strength of the actual user authentication. So I think at some point we'll see some intersection there, but at least where I'm at, I haven't seen it yet.
So that's the topic for next year, is how it all gets tied together, and with proof of possession, right?
So there's a lot of individual components. There are a few people like DISA who are working on kind of end-to-end profiles for those higher end use cases, but they will be hopefully public soon, so we can start having some of those discussions about what a true proof of possession end-to-end system looks like. We have the components, but it's not everybody that has that desire yet. The attackers have to get slightly better before everyone panics and says, that's what I want. We have to keep ahead of the attackers, which sometimes is hard because people don't see the value yet.
Okay, so you talk about keeping ahead of attackers. So let's just balance that. I mean, Kim, you said something earlier about what Andrew said in his keynote, Andrew Nash said in his keynote, this idea that we write specs in waves, right? And you get recurring themes of us trying to solve the same problems in different ways over and over again. Where do you all see this next wave going? So, and how good is the wave we have now, and how do you see that lifespan of our current standards wave?
Well, I think that we've made a tremendous amount of progress, but the way it worked was amusing, really, because what happened was. There is this phenomenon which I used to call protocol gas. And it's sort of the occupational hazard of working with protocols. Anybody who gets too close to a protocol gets the side effects of this gas, and they become deaf with regards to other protocols. They start to imagine their protocol is immensely important, and the other protocols all don't exist. And they sort of become megalomaniacal. And it's just a natural product of working with a protocol, in my view.
If the shoe fits, I'm saying.
Of course, it doesn't affect anyone here. But what happens then is people who deploy protocols end up with this massive infrastructure which is working on protocol 1. And along comes the people who develop protocol 2 and are intoxicated by it, trying to get it deployed, but they don't understand that actually protocol 1 isn't going to go away. In this world of identity, protocols only come. They never leave. It's like Hotel California on a massive scale. And so when you actually invent a new protocol, you have to take into account what it's going to actually happen in reality. What's going to happen in reality is there's going to be basically a collision between these two things, and people are going to have to sort it out. And sort of in our role, I think a lot of us who develop new protocols also are responsible for managing old protocols, and so we become completely schizophrenic in the sense that we're creating the problems that we then have to solve. But on the other hand, we have to do that because there are these big issues around cybersecurity and hackers and vulnerabilities that weren't predicted, and the fact that we're learning. This is a whole new world of technology that was never explored before, and naturally there are going to be problems here. And so you see this whole protocol guess thing happening over and over again, and we still have protocols that were known to be unsafe 15 years ago in use. Because if we turn them off, the masses become angry and they turn them back on again. So, it's not a matter of something that anybody can control just because of basic hygiene or things like that. This is outside of anyone's control. So I see that as the question then becomes, for people who are overwhelmed by having all of these protocols that they have to deal with, how do you then get them to find time to take advantage of the new features that are coming in the new protocol? And so perhaps the most important part of a new protocol is making it frictionless to be implemented and adopted. And yet, in the minds of the new protocol developers, they're replacing the world. They're replacing the stupid protocols of the past. So if there's anything that I could wish for, would be that the developers of the new protocols would actually learn that they live in this ecology of protocols, and they have to understand that. So for example, with DID, I'm a huge believer that DID simplifies. Basically, it solves the fundamental architectural problem of the web being upside down, in the sense that users don't own their own identities and don't own their own data. Because it was upside down, we ended up with a whole bunch of protocols that were very convoluted. That's my basic thinking. Now we're faced with the opportunity, for a number of reasons, including the fact that a technology like blockchain has arisen that nobody controls, which makes it really different, whether you like it or not. And what allows us to do is to create a new infrastructure where everybody owns things. And because it's right side up, so much can be simplified, fundamentally simplified. But the question is, okay, how do we get from this complex goo to that ultimate simplification? And so that means, first thing is, we have to unify DID, this new decentralized identity, OpenID Connect self-issued, and FIDO2. They're all just ways of having pairwise keys that work together, and yet we have three I mean, this is really wonderful, guys. 3 new protocols arriving simultaneously. Isn't that great? So what we have to do is make sure that through WebAuthn, we can unify all of those things so that all of them can live in an ecology where they're not competing against each other and requiring one to be replaced by the other. And yet, that's the last thing that is on the minds of the people developing the new protocols.
Right.
So how do we as a community change that?
Right. So we are running out of time. We have one last question. You're talking about what that next wave and what the convergence can be. So my question to you is, there are people out here who might be really interested in affecting that future and who look up here and see you all as role models to follow in their footsteps. I know, right?
That's probably a hideous.
It's a little concerning. So my last question to you is, what advice do you have for people who might be interested in getting into standards and being able to drive this future? How would you advise them to get going in order to help change the future?
So first of all, I would say if you're out in the audience looking up here and not seeing yourself reflected up here, like, that's a problem, and that shouldn't mean you're not involved in standards. That means we need to get you involved in standards. One of the big challenges that I think we have that it's really easy for us to overlook is we all are coming to the standard space, the technology space, with our perspectives in mind and our experiences in mind, and that's informing the technical decisions that we're making and what's going into these standards, what kinds of identities are being supported by them. And if we're not taking into account the full spectrum of identities, then we're going to end up with protocols that are actually leaving a whole lot of people out in the cold.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. And I can only double down on that. Your use case is important. One big difference from the old times of the old wave of protocols is that now we have a large community and the bar for entry is super low. Like you just sign up for a mailing list and you speak your mind on mail. It's that easy. And given that consensus is expensive, typically we try to be very conservative and we only talk about the things that we know for certain that are going to be used. So if you don't chime in with your use case might be overlooked. And that doesn't mean that your use case isn't important. It's simply that we miss your voice, we miss your perspective. So don't be shy, find the IETF, find the mailing list, sign up for a mailing list, look at the archive, see some of the exchanges so that you get a feeling of what is the etiquette there, which is not particularly high. Like people speak their mind in a pretty open fashion. And please, please, please participate.
So standards organizations have sort of changed over the years. I remember when I first tried to become involved with SAML, it required $300 for me personally. I could only participate in one working group because I didn't work for a company that was on the board, and essentially it was a very closed elite group of people that were allowed to work on that standard, and it wasn't especially welcoming. Oasis was a little bit more open, but essentially if you're not a corporate member, you're out of luck. W3C is still, it has fairly high membership bar. FIDO is also sort of problematic from a standards point of view. I've been advocating. Everybody should encourage FIDO to move the CTAP standards to IETF. Just write your FIDO representative, because those standards should be open. I've talked to lots of people who, even somebody at NIST who wants to do some work on CTAP2 who can't actually get at the latest editor's version of the spec because it's behind a paywall. But IETF, OpenID Foundation, the newer standards organizations, just turn up. It's as easy as subscribing to a mailing list. You don't necessarily have to go to a physical meeting. You can join teleconference calls and stuff. I know language is still, I live in Latin America. We have fairly low participation because language is still a barrier. So it's a very English-oriented sorts of organizations. But my advice to people here is basically turn up. If you want to talk to somebody about how to do that, I'm sure all of us, you can find our names plastered all over the internet. We don't hide, and we're more than happy to help people get involved and get started. But it's mostly a matter of being willing to put in some time and get engaged on the lists. And it's not necessarily yes, I am particularly scary, but it's not as scary as people imagine.
By the way, did you notice that his mic is clipped to his beard? Did you see that? I think that's so great.
It's actually the beard that's talking.
It's the beard talking. Kim, how about you?
People have beard envy, I know.
I'm working on one. But no, I think, my approach has been either you create the standard because you got a problem and therefore you're sort of have some ideas and you're starting it off, or if other people create it, it's something that you're going to have to deal with at some point. And so I think what I've always tried to do is to get my hands on dirty on it early on, but not too early. Too early and it's a catastrophe. You have to wait until there's something that works, and then play with it enough, have somebody play with it enough to know what it is. Because I think you have to play with it, because it's all new, it's like coming out of nowhere. You have to play with it. And then once you play with it, you can figure out what is the impact going to be on my business, on my work, on my beliefs. And once you've done that, then the question is, you may want to intervene in some of these organizations, and not necessarily as an individual, but maybe you're part of an industry association that could intervene. Some way to intervene in order to ensure that you aren't harmed by the new standards that arise.
Right. And Brian, take us home.
I don't have a whole lot to add. I'll just show up, I think. And although a lot of these bodies are governed by arcane and strange processes, they're not that bad once you wade into them. And I think you'll find that people are generally more welcoming and accepting than it might at first seem. John being
we let you in.
Yeah.
But you have to have a very patient disposition.
Indeed.
To participate. So it isn't for everyone.
Yeah, my rule of thumb is that standards are about 80% politics and 20% technology.
See, to me, standards are bloody-mindedness. You have to be bloody-minded to actually participate, I think. But anyways,
Really?
we better go. We are over time. But thank you so much to this amazing panel of standards experts. I really appreciate it. All right. Good job, guys.